is a nightmare. Man, that's the way it seems. Life is a nightmare.
Welcome to Today in Horrible History, your daily moment of historical misfortune. For January 31st, 2022, we're headed back to January 31st, 1865. On that date, the U.S. Congress passed the 13th Amendment to the United States Constitution. This is usually taught as the end of slavery in the country, so you might be questioning how this could be horrible history. The text of the amendment, however, does not exactly say what most people think it does, with devastating consequences to this day. African slaves were brought into British colonies which later became the United States beginning in 1619, largely to do agricultural labor. Given growing seasons and local economies, this meant slavery was concentrated in the South. Most of the African American population in the U.S. today are descended from these slaves. The American Civil War fought almost entirely over the issue of slavery, despite some strained arguments to the contrary, was a bloody fight between the more industrial North, which had little to no slavery depending on the state, and the largely agricultural South, which had built their entire society around it. The war lasted 1861 through 1865 and cost probably well over 1 million lives in a country which at the time only had 32 million people to begin with, 4 million of whom were slaves. In 1863, President Abraham Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation, another document which did less than is popularly believed, a subject for another video on a different day, which provided for limited cessation of slavery. The American Constitution, written back in the 18th century, accepted and promoted slavery. An amendment of the document was a necessary legal formality to end slavery as the war wound down and it was evident the North would prevail. An amendment had to be passed by Congress and ratified by a supermajority of states. At the time, the 13th was ratified by 27 of the 36 necessary states, but not without some hiccups. Northern states without slavery and southern states now occupied by Union forces voted for the 13th. Things were not so obvious for Delaware and Kentucky, two states which had slavery but had also remained in the Union during the war, and thereby were not occupied by Union troops as they were part of the Union. Delaware wouldn't ceremonially ratify the 13th until 1901, and Kentucky not until 1976. Optics for the upcoming bicentennial celebrations that were just a few months later. Mississippi somehow didn't get around to a ceremonial full ratification of the 13th Amendment until 2013. At that point, really, why bother? But all of this is a sideshow compared to the damage done by the text of the amendment itself, which could have simply stated that forced servitude was unconstitutional and left it there. It does not. This is the actual text. Quote, "Neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as a punishment for crime whereof the party shall have been duly convicted, shall exist within the United States." That "except as" clause was a poison pill and made possible a continuation of outright slavery in the country for another 80 years. If you can get a person convicted for any crime, you can send them to prison and legally compel them to work for little to no money. Especially after the eventual withdrawal of Union troops from the southern states, African American citizens, mostly men, were targeted for ridiculous charges for the sole purpose of imprisoning them and forcing them to do free labor. One common example is that any man traveling from one town to another, even while seeking work, could be charged with vagrancy, sent to prison, and forced to work. Many former slaves found themselves still working for their plantation owners in the sharecropping system, a system dependent on cycles of debt which were difficult to work out of. At the time, peony, or indebtedness, was also a crime, which also resulted in prison time. Much of this awful 80 years of history is covered in the excellent PBS program Slavery by Another Name. There's a link in the description. Prisoners were forced to do infrastructure projects such as road building, but were also contracted out by prisons for-profit private businesses. This included farms, coal mines, and steel mills. There was not a single prosecution for enslaving people in the South until 1940, the brink of World War II. The effects that nasty "except for" clause, they continue today. The United States has more than 2 million citizens in prison, more than any other country on the planet, and many of them work for pennies, as the 13th Amendment does not require them to be paid anything at all. Some prisoners do factory-type labor, but call centers and other surprising jobs are frequently placed in American prisons in order to take advantage of the nearly free labor. Keep in mind that more than 98% of American prisoners do not even have a constitutionally described trial to determine their guilt. More than 9 in 10 American convictions are via plea deal, in which prosecutors charge defendants with a list of crimes with years and years of prison time attached, and push the defendant to waive their trial rights and admit guilt to a shorter list of crimes. Almost no part of the judicial system works in the manner people are taught it works in civics classes. Additionally, the federal courts have interpreted the 13th in a very narrow fashion. The Supreme Court established that the military draft, for example, was exempt from the 13th, presumably because 2 years of fighting a war involuntarily isn't really work. And community service requirements for high school graduation have similarly been interpreted to be perfectly well constitutional. In short, to this day, the United States is not the best country for expecting to get paid for doing work. And the one American with any high profile who fully understands this and has been vocal about it has been Kanye West. Be sure to like this video and subscribe to the channel for more Today in Horrible History. Remember that after a brief visit, the rest of your day can only seem better in comparison.
Life is a nightmare. Man, that's the way it seems. Life is a nightmare.